February for us is one of the busiest months on the farm because February is the time for fruit tree planting. But if you're going to be planting your trees according to permaculture, it gets somewhat complicated. So we planted a bulk of these trees in this farm in 2022 and 2023. Some of the trees were planted in 2019, but these were the border trees, these were the windbreakers. They were forming a kind of a barrier between our organic farm and our neighbor's conventional farm. But if you were to say plant an apple orchard or a pear orchard or an apricot orchard, all that you would need to do is make tidy long rows and plant these trees at equal distances. But here on this farm, we are trying to grow all kinds of trees, all kinds of fruit trees and berries together in a kind of a mishmash of an ecosystem where we have the plums, we have the pears, we have the nectarines, we have the apples, we have the cherries. So all kinds of fruits and berries growing in a very diverse kind of a setup. For example, this here is a plum tree and its neighbor is not a plum tree but an apple tree. Now this apple tree is a doffing rootstock. It is on the M9 rootstock and it has this variety on top, and this variety is the dark barren gala. So we have the plum tree here and the neighbor is the apple tree, and then the next tree here is not the apple tree but a cherry tree again on a rootstock, a doffing rootstock, the Jezela 6, and its neighbor is not a cherry tree but the sea buckthorn. Now sea buckthorn is not really a tree, it's a kind of a shrub and it's native to the higher Himalayas, native to Spiti and Ladakh. This shrub is a nitrogen fixer. Now it has these nodules in its roots where the nitrogen fixing bacteria resides. This nitrogen fixing bacteria in the sea buckthorn is called the Frankia bacteria. Now Frankia bacteria is a bacteria which resides in the nodules, and the roots of this shrub, they go really deep. They also will distribute the nitrogen to its neighboring trees. In this case we have the cherry tree over here and we also have a cherry tree in front of it, which means that these trees, these neighboring trees, are also going to benefit by having a nitrogen fixing shrub like the sea buckthorn as its neighbor. Now if you go on ahead, we have here again a cherry tree, and then the next one over here we have autumn olive. Now autumn olive is native to this part of the world. It's a shrub, again a nitrogen fixing shrub just like our sea buckthorn. This shrub also has this bacteria called the Frankia bacteria. Now if you look at most of the legumes, they have a bacteria which is the rhizobium bacteria in the nodules, but in the case of these shrubs, the sea buckthorn and the autumn olive, or the ghai as we call them in Pahari, they have a bacteria called the Frankia bacteria residing in the nodules. These beneficial nitrogen fixing neighbors are going to benefit their neighboring trees. But as far as the understory of these trees are concerned, we have planted the strawberries. So in this system of planting, we do not have the same species side by side. We always have a different species as the neighbor. The plum tree has this apple tree as the neighbor, and the apple tree has this cherry tree as the neighbor, and so on and so forth. Now there is a method in this madness. We are socially distancing these trees from each other. We are socially distancing this particular species from its own kind. For example, if this tree gets infected by some disease, it's going to be localized to this tree and it is not going to spread as it happens in all monocultures, whether they are organic farming or whether they are conventional farming. So this is one way to stave off diseases. Now how do we hope to do it? All pests visit a farm, but they will breed in a farm only when they see a large source of food. So any monoculture system, whether organic or chemical, is going to be conducive for breeding for these pests because monoculture systems are going to be that large source of food for them. But in a biodiverse ecosystem where you have many kinds of trees growing together, a pest is going to come but not breed. It's not going to spread because that is not going to be a large source of food for them. It's not going to be conducive enough for breeding for the next generation for them to thrive on, because fruit trees do not thankfully share their pests. So for example, the apple aphid is called an apple aphid because it infects the apple tree alone. It is not going to infect the cherry tree or its neighbor, the sea buckthorn tree. Apple aphid would definitely want to breed in a monoculture of apples. Now, this is what we have learned also from COVID, that we need to socially distance ourselves from one another to prevent the spread of any infection. And this is the same principle at play here on this farm. Now, in this very diverse, seemingly complicated system where different species of trees are growing side by side, they cannot be planted uniformly. They will need to be planted obviously according to the species they are. Now, every variety that we have on the farm grows on a kind of a rootstock. The rootstock is the root on which the variety is grafted. Rootstock determines the growth of the tree. It determines how susceptible it's going to be or not going to be to diseases. It's going to determine how tall the tree is going to grow. So we have to distance, we have to plant these trees accordingly. Now, for example, this one over here I know is a plum growing on a rootstock called the myrobalan. Now, myrobalan is a semi-dwarfing rootstock. Now, while planting, we have to allocate the space to this tree according to how tall this tree is going to grow. So here we have a semi-dwarfing rootstock, but its neighbor is a pear tree, and the pear tree is growing on a rootstock called the Quince 29C. Now, this rootstock is going to keep this tree, this pear tree, slightly smaller than the rootstock that we have over here, the myrobalan 29C. Not only that, this tree is going to be having a different kind of a formation compared to the plum tree. Now, if you look at this plum tree, the plum tree over here is going to have an open center formation compared to the pear tree. The pear tree is going to have what is called a tall spindle formation, where we're going to have a central leader, and these branches are going to be growing laterally from this central stem, which we are allowing to grow tall. Over here, nothing in the center. These branches are going to be spreading in all the four cardinal directions. Over here, one central leader. So this will have to be planted according to the kind of, not only the kind of species that you are planting next to each other, but also the kind of rootstock it's growing on. Now, if you go further, over here we have this apple tree. Now, the apple tree is growing on a much smaller, or rather the smallest dwarfing rootstock that we have on the farm. This is the M9. The M9 does not take too much space to grow. It does not spread too much. The kind of space that we need for the M9 to grow is roughly 3 feet. So the distance between this tree, this apple tree and the pear tree is not going to be much. It's going to be roughly 4 feet, because these branches again are going to be growing in a tall spindle formation. Just like the pear tree, these are the palm fruits that grow in a particular kind of formation, which is called the central leader or the tall spindle formation. Unlike the stone fruit trees, which are its neighbors, which are going to grow in an open vase or a wine goblet formation where there is nothing in the center. As you can notice, we do not need too much space between these two trees for this reason. But as far as the plum tree is concerned, it has an open center, but we have, that's why, spaced this at, now if I measure it, the space between this tree, this plum tree and the pear tree is almost 5 feet, but the space between the pear tree and the apple tree, both of which are dwarfing varieties of rootstock, is slightly more than 3 feet. So this is the reason that it takes a lot of time to grow anything on this farm, because we have to measure everything, everything is calculated, and you need to know the kind of rootstock everything is growing on, because there are different kinds of rootstocks, and also the formation of the trees, as you can see, is very different. Tall spindle over here and an open center over here where there is nothing in the center. Now, like I said in the beginning, we are following permaculture very loosely. We are adapting it to our own needs. We are not really following it to the letter. Now, if you were to follow permaculture and its planting methods to the letter, it would become a little bit more complicated and a little bit more difficult. For example, permaculture recommends that you have one fruit tree and the next tree has to be a nitrogen fixing tree, and then a fruit tree and a nitrogen fixing tree. So you alternate nitrogen fixing trees after every fruit tree. Now that is going to be absolutely not only impractical but also a colossal wastage of space. Permaculture, let's be honest, comes from a position of privilege. A lot of permaculturists do not actually admit it, but permaculture is a kind of an option, a kind of a privileged farming that a lot of people who want to do, who can do this kind of farming, do it. This is not something that somebody who is depending on farming for a livelihood can sort of afford to experiment. People of privilege, myself included, can experiment with this kind of farming because we have different sources of revenue and we can play around with our farm and experiment and see what works for us and what does not work for us. Now, if you follow permaculture to the letter, like I was saying, then permaculture also advocates not actually growing anything in the kind of topography that we have over here. This kind of an undulating, very rough kind of a terrain, mountainous terrain that we have over here, according to permaculture, should be left for forestry. You should only grow forests over here, not really any fruit trees. Now, this kind of a theory obviously comes from a position of privilege where you have a lot of land. Like, for example, the founder of permaculture, Bill Mollison, was from Australia, where there's no shortage of land, where you can sort of choose and pick where you want to plant your fruit trees and grow your nitrogen fixing trees alongside every fruit tree. But it's not possible where the land holding is less. It's not possible in a poor country like India, and it cannot happen in this part of the world, for example, where people have been living and farming here since ages, and suddenly leave it for forestry and look for some very stable, very flat land where they can grow all these trees. So we are managing, we are tweaking permaculture principles to our own needs. Wherever it's feasible to us, we follow it. Where it doesn't suit us, we let it be. We follow science and its principles work for us, and some of them don't work for us. This is an experiment. Like I said, this is a privilege that farmers like myself need to acknowledge, and this kind of practice is obviously not for the regular farmer for whom farming is bread and butter, his sole income. And we over here are practicing all this because we can. So we at MeenaBagh Farms are a new experimental high altitude permaculture farm up here in the Himalayas. And now we are going to be documenting our journey, our failures, our progress. And if you want to be part of our journey, do consider hitting the subscribe button.